Hello, wherever you are, wherever you all are. I want to. This week we're going to. This week we're going to have a next of our online lectures, online commentaries, and this week I'm going to talk quite briefly, I think, about the conflicts in Slovenia. Quite a short one. And then the beginning of a conflict, more serious and what will be a longer lasting conflict in Croatia. So this is in 1991 and 1992. And we'll come to that in a minute. But before I do, I just wanted to give you a quick update because some of you have been sending me emails about your assignments, which at least according to the booklet, will be due this week. What I thought I would do is, because I know it's a little bit, things are a bit strange at the moment, aren't they? What with the closure, and I know that some of you have sort of, your plans have been quite seriously disrupted, quite significantly disrupted by everything that's happening in the country and indeed in the world. So with this in mind, what I thought I would do is extend slightly the deadline for the first assignment. The new deadline is the 3rd of April. The 3rd of April. That's Friday, not this Friday, but the Friday afterwards. So about a week and a half's time. And what I also wanted to do was open up a consultation. For those of you who wanted to, you're always, of course, very welcome to email me with any questions, either about the assignment or about the course, and we can talk about those over email. But if anybody wants a consultation, either by Skype or by Zoom, or in some other online platform, some live platform, particularly about the upcoming assignment, we can do that as well. For 10 or 15 minutes, we can talk about your work. And I've opened up an afternoon from sort of 4 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon, the 31st of March. For anybody who would like to do that, I put that up. I've sent that to you in an email, and I put that up on Moodle. But I just wanted to reiterate that kind of important information for you here as well. So the 3rd of April for the first assignment, and if anybody wants to talk about it with me, we can do that on the 31st of March. You're very welcome to contact me. If you contact me via email, we can set that up. Okay, so let's get back to Yugoslavia. Let's get back to the Balkans. First of all, we can recap where we left off last week. We talked about Milosevic, hadn't we? And I'd shown the way that he was really upsetting the post-Tito balance, that his change of political style and his change in approach to politics was something that was really unwanted and unexpected and unfamiliar in Yugoslavia. When Tito had died, the hope was that the country would now be run at the Republican level, and the presidency would be rotated amongst the republics. And this had held not very efficiently throughout the 1980s, at least the first half of the 1980s. And we'd seen in the middle of the 1980s that Slobodan Milosevic had opportunistically grabbed hold of the opportunities it used the issue of Kosovo and used the supposed persecution of Serbs there, but also throughout Yugoslavia, to propel his own political fortunes. And by the end of the 1980s, we'd seen that Milosevic had become a very powerful figure, that he controlled 4 parts of this post-Tito setup, didn't he? He controlled Serbia, Montenegro, the 2 republics. The leadership and the votes belonged to him from those 2 republics. But he also controlled the autonomous provinces, the leaderships of the northern autonomous province of Vojvodina, and also, of course, Kosovo, where his political fortunes had really began in 1986. So he'd become a very powerful figure. And this was very concerning, as we spoke about last week, to the communist leadership in Slovenia and in Croatia. And I talked a little bit about what was happening in those republics, and I'd shown that they were going in quite a different direction to the one that Milosevic seemed to be taking Yugoslavia. That both Croatia and Slovenia were much richer, much more Western oriented, and were very concerned about what was happening in Milosevic's Yugoslavia, Milosevic's Serbia. In the case of Slovenia, there'd been a real turning point, hadn't there? In 1988, there had been this trial of journalists who were writing for the news magazine, the satirical news magazine Mladina, or Youth. They had been put on trial in Ljubljana, in the capital, for supposedly insulting the Yugoslav People's Army, the powerful JNA. And the trial and the way it was staged, really in this kind of humiliating way for the Mladina journalists, had really kind of brought together Slovene politics and Slovene society, that they were very unhappy with the way the JNA were treating those people, those Slovene journalists, that they felt this was symbolic more broadly of the way Slovenia could be expected to be treated in Yugoslavia. And this had really been a game changer at the end of the 1980s in Slovenia. And meanwhile, we'd also looked at what was happening around about the same time in Croatia. I'd shown you that politics increasingly was rallying around this very controversial figure of a man named Franjo Tudjman. And I'd shown you that Franjo Tudjman's legacy, his career after 1945, had been a very circuitous and a very unusual one. He'd started out as a partisan general during the Second World War, fighting alongside Tito. Thereafter, he'd become a historian. As a historian, he'd started to challenge some of the partisan myths, particularly vis-a-vis the Ustasha, the Croatian fascist movement. And he'd written a very controversial study of the death camp Jasenovac, and he'd claimed that in actual fact genocide had not taken place there, and the numbers of Serbs particularly who'd been killed at the camp was actually much lower than the official figures would have us believe. He'd taken part in this kind of part in this reform movement at the beginning of the 1970s, and then he'd sort of been he'd been persecuted by the Tito regime. He'd been expelled from the party, expelled from his position as a historian at the Workers' Institute, and he'd become kind of a prisoner of consciousness, according to Amnesty International, in the 1980s. Now, he'd started to gather around him various figures who were also opposed to Tito's Yugoslavia, very many people from the diaspora, and he was starting to rally what looked like a kind of Croatian national movement. And I told you that the Croatian Republic had been very quiet in the 70s and the 1980s, but now at the end of the 1980s under Tudjman, things were starting to change, and it looked like there would be some sort of movement, that there would be some challenge to the status quo coming from Tudjman. Now, I think I also mentioned, and if I did not mention it now, that Tudjman was quite a problematic figure. He was not a moderate person. He did not appear as a moderate person. And this was true in the 1980s, but it was also true in the 1990s. It was things like his attitude towards the Ustasha, which was very equivocating, very rationalizing, almost to some extent justifying what they had done, although remaining quite critical of the Ustasha themselves. He would be willing to sort of salvage some part of their legacy. Now, he was also when he moved around the diaspora in places like Australia and the United States of America, trying to rally support for Croats and for Croats within Yugoslavia. He courted some groups which would have caused worry for people back in the country. Not always, but very often, those diaspora groups were associated with refugees who had left the country at the end of the Second World War, and many of them had indeed been involved with the Ustasha state, with the independent state of Croatia, with various parts of the sort of the right-wing anti-communist movement. During the Cold War, people had not really paid much attention to them. Not in the United States and not in Great Britain or Germany. They would not have known too much about them, but they were very well known back in Yugoslavia, and many people back there were kind of concerned with the way that Tudjman seemed to be taking money and taking support from diaspora figures who were quite right wing. And who were quite sympathetic towards some very dark parts of Croatia's history, to the Ustasha and to that period of Croatian history. So there are a lot of, there was a lot of reason for concern. And as we'll find out a bit later on, this was particularly concerning to the Serbian minority who lived in Croatia. And I think I told you, in any case, we can look at the map in a minute, but I have shown it to you before. That a large part of the population living in the Socialist Republic of Croatia were ethnic Serbs. They'd been there a very long time, and they were particularly concerned with what they thought Tudjman represented, the way he was downplaying the Ustasha, the way he was courting people who had been involved, if not them, then their fathers perhaps, or their parents had been involved with the Ustasha state during the Second World War. Now, it is important to remember that Serbian minority were the focus of the Ustasha genocide during the Second World War. So that community had a very strong sense of its suffering and of its victimhood during the Second World War, and that those communities of Serbs living in Croatia would have heard from their parents or their grandparents how they had been targeted and how they had been slaughtered by the Croats, by the Ustasha at least, during the Second World War. So that was a very delicate matter, a very emotive matter for many Serbs who were living in those areas. They were very concerned at the prospect of Tudjman and his supporters taking control of Croatia. They didn't want that to happen. So this is another thing. Now, we left it, didn't we? The last thing I told you is that in 1991, there'd been this very dramatic showdown at the 14th Party Congress in Belgrade in the beginning of 1990. The Slovene and the Croat parties, Republican communist parties, had left the Congress, also, in fact, leaving the Yugoslav Communist Party. They had held elections thereafter. In Slovenia, a reform movement, social democratic movement party had won the elections. And in Croatia, Franjo Tudjman's party, which was known as the Croatian Democratic Union, the HDZ, had won elections there. Both of them had then gone on to hold referendums on whether or not they should stay within Yugoslavia. In both cases, overwhelming majorities of the people who turned out to vote had voted in favour, and it was about 85%, I think, in Slovenia. So a massive landslide there. And in Croatia it was about 96%. But very importantly, Croatia's Serbs, the Serbian minority, had boycotted this referendum. They've been instructed to do so by the leadership there, and I'll come to them in a minute. So both countries went ahead then, both republics went ahead with their declarations of independence. Slovenia and Croatia, they coordinated their declarations of independence, so they would take place pretty much at the same time, and this was in June 1991. Slovenia left, I think, on the 26th of June. And Croatia left on the 27th, so a day apart to kind of coordinate as a show of kind of solidarity and a show of support. Now, this was the beginning of the conflicts, and the first conflict took place in Slovenia. This is now slide number 2. of the slideshow. This was a very limited conflict, and I'll tell you why that was. The war just lasted for 10 days. It's known as the TenDay War in Slovene history. And it was waged on the one hand by the Yugoslav People's Army and on the other hand by Slovene police and Slovene militias. And the JNA essentially were following orders. They were following their war plans, one of which dictated that in the event that one republic attempted to secede, the JNA would immediately move in great force simply to secure the border and to prevent the secession from taking place. So this had always gone back to the time of Tito. This had always been one of the JNA's possible scenarios. Another one was like an invasion from the Soviet Union or an invasion from NATO. An invasion from maybe from Italy or something like this. But there's also this notion that a separatist movement might rise up within the country, which needed to be dealt with. So that they had been kind of prepared for this. Now, I'd mentioned earlier in a few lectures ago the composition of the JNA officer corps, that they still saw themselves as old guard communists, guardians of the partisan revolution, guardians of Tito's revolution, whose job it was to protect the legacy of the revolution and to protect the legacy of Yugoslavia. Now that remained true right up until 1991, but for many of these old generals and these old colonels, the chiefs of staff of the Yugoslav People's Army, their worries, their concerns for the revolution, for the state, had become exacerbated by what they were seeing elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe. And of course, you must remember that this is the time, isn't it, of these great dramatic transformations throughout Europe, throughout Eastern and Central Europe. 1989 is this kind of domino of communist regimes coming to an end in Eastern and Central Europe. And the JNA, feared, and of course rightly believed, that the same thing was happening in Slovenia. That this was a case of what they call counter-revolution, of anti-communist forces rising up within the country to sort of dismantle the country. So the war lasted 10 days, and it was a very chaotic affair. The JNA didn't exactly know what was going on. They had a lot of problems with the recruits, of course, who were unwilling to fight. There's some very famous scenes captured on television where very raw recruits, 19, 20-year-olds, who were sieging Slovene cities like Ljubljana, were interviewed. They came from Bosnia, or they came from sort of, Montenegro, and they were being asked what they were doing. And in many cases, it was clear that they didn't know what they were doing because they had not been told by their commanding officers. Or their commanding officers had lied to them. They had claimed that this was simply a war game, or that this was a foreign invasion, or something like this. And there's a very famous scene of a Bosnian recruit, just a kid really, like an 18-year-old, who's being interviewed on Slovene television, and they're asking him, so what's happening? What are you doing? Why are you pointing these guns at Ljubljana? And he's saying, well, it's like, they're attacking and we're supposed to be defending. But he keeps saying, and it's clear that he thinks this is just a simulation, that they've told him. They haven't told him the truth. And of course, this is actually against the rules of warfare, to lie, to lie in this way, to conceal in this way, mission objectives and war aims in this way. This is not, you have to give people the chance to sort of, to disobey illegal rules. You have to tell them what's going on, and then they were not telling them what was going on. Now, it ended quite quickly. It's about 60 casualties, and the war ended in a period of 10 days, and it ended when Milosevic ordered the JNA to retreat from Slovenia. And the reason he did this was a very clear one. Milosevic's ideas and Milosevic's hopes for what would happen in Yugoslavia and what would emerge were very rapidly changing as events changed, as things happened in the country. It seems that it had always originally been Milosevic's hope and Milosevic's goal to become something like a new Tito, to lord it over Yugoslavia, to be the absolute ruler, the absolute master of Yugoslavia. And, he had largely achieved this at the beginning of the 1990s by controlling these various parts of the country, the Serbian Republic, the Montenegrin Republic, the autonomous provinces of Kosovo and Vojvodina. He looked very much like the most powerful person. And it seems that his plan A was to control Yugoslavia and to keep Yugoslavia together, but with him as its leader, with him as the all-powerful figure. But the behavior and the responses of Croatia and Slovenia appear to have changed Milosevic's thinking. And particularly, as we'll find out a little bit later on, when the new European Union and the international community were kind of supporting the independence desires, the independence drives of Croatia and Slovenia. When this happened, and when Slovenia and Croatia declared independence, it seems that Milosevic at this stage was ready to move to Plan B. That he accepted that his initial idea, which was, as I say, to control all of Yugoslavia and to bring it under his own authority, under his own control, that this was rapidly slipping through his fingers. And so he was willing to move to Plan B. And Plan B was not to sort of, not to keep Yugoslavia, not to keep Tito's state, but to abandon Tito's state, and instead try to create an expanded Serbian state that would include all of the Serbs who had lived in Yugoslavia. So if that sort of makes sense, it's quite complicated, and it's worth going to read the books that I've assigned for you online. And if you want to email me or talk to me indeed more about Milosevic's thinking and the way he tried to achieve these goals, there's a vast literature. Of course, a lot of books have been written, a lot of articles have been written about Milosevic, and so there's a lot of things that you can read and look up about him. But essentially, what he was now doing is he's looking at the map, and he was saying to himself, "Well, look, Yugoslavia is dead. There's no rescuing it. This chaotic conflict in Slovenia, if you like, has sort of proven that this can't be saved. So instead, we need to move to this kind of idea of keeping all of the Serbs together, of creating an expanded state." Which is Serbia, but which includes all of the Serbs, wherever they may be, whether they be in Bosnia or whether they be in Croatia. And of course, the problem with this war aim, the problem with this goal, is it involved trampling on the sovereignty of various other parts of what had been Yugoslavia, of Croatia, and as we'll see later on next week, also of Bosnia. So it would be a very difficult thing to achieve, and it would need to be achieved with military force. But if we stick for the time being to slide number 2, the 10-day war in Slovenia ended quite quickly, and it did so quite simply because there were no meaningful numbers of Serbs within Slovenia. And Milosevic was no longer interested in keeping Yugoslavia together as it had been. So he was quite, he was quite pragmatic about Slovenia. He was willing to let that go. There was some confusion within the JNA, but increasingly the JNA was beginning to look like something that was simply being controlled, if you like, manipulated by Milosevic. It was being purged of Croat and Slovene officers. So the officer corps was looking increasingly Serbian, Serbo-centric, ethnocentric, and it was increasingly looking like an extra sort of thing that Milosevic could use in the conflict. So after 10 days of chaotic fighting, Milosevic essentially concedes defeat He accepts that Slovenia is going to leave the Union. Slovenia is going to be an independent state, and now the more important battles need to be held elsewhere. So he withdraws the Yugoslav People's Army, but in most cases he withdraws them into barracks in Croatia. So a large amount of military power, a large amount of military force is amassing now within the Croatian Republic. Now it's clear what's coming. Milosevic sees now that the real battles are still to be fought. The real battles will take place where there are large numbers of Serbs, and the most immediate the most immediate battleground is Croatia, which has made this declaration of independence, but which contains within its republican, now I suppose national borders, very large numbers of Serbs. Now, if you skip forward to slide number 4. Slide number 4. That's that ethnocentric map that I've been showing you in previous lectures. That gives you an idea of the distribution of Serbs. I told you the Serbs are the purple splodges, and as you can see, there are very large numbers of Serbs in parts of Croatia, but also distributed throughout Bosnia. So the JNA has now been pulled back, and it's now massing its forces within Croatia. Now, if we skip forward to slide number 5, the sort of what's been going on in Croatia during this kind of political crisis, but before the Declaration of Independence in 1991. Things have been getting very tense in Croatia. The Serbian minority, the largest number of which are living kind of in the south of the country, in a part of the country called the Krajina, and the largest city, the largest town in the Krajina is a place called Knin. Serbs have been becoming increasingly nervous about the direction that Tudjman seems to be taking, or wanting to be taking, Croatia in. Now, it seems that the first choice of those Serbs would be to remain in Yugoslavia, not to be separated from their brethren in Serbia, in Bosnia, other Serbs in other parts of the country. That would be their first kind of choice. But on top of this, so the notion that Croatia could become an independent state is a very worrisome one for many people for many of these Serbs living in Croatia. It's as I said earlier, it's certainly true that Tudjman has handled this process very insensitively. There's this Jasenovac story that I've told you about. There's the kind of people that he's hanging out with in the diaspora. People who were associated or not that far removed from the Ustaša movement of the Second World War. But on top of all of this, there's also propaganda. Throughout the beginning of the 1990s, the Serbs living in Croatia have been bombarded by state television, which is broadcast out of Belgrade, and is now completely controlled by Milosevic loyalists, by Milosevic's allies. And of course, they've been telling stories of how Tudjman and how his designs for an independent state are essentially sort of replicas of the Ustaša state during the Second World War. And the implications of this being that if Croatia becomes independent, then what will happen to the Serbs living in Croatia is exactly what happened to them during the Second World War, which is to say they'll be subjected to genocidal policies, that they'll be killed, that they'll be persecuted, that they'll have a very terrible time under this. So very many of these communities are really kind of convinced that this is what will happen to them, that this is going to become a reality. Now, even before the Declaration of Independence, many of those communities have started to kind of barricade themselves into the parts of the country that they're living in. Very famously, at the beginning of 1991, the Serbian communities living in Croatia blocked the roads using logs, that, kind of chopped down wood, and put up large kind of logs over the roads in and out of the Serbian municipalities and the Serbian parts of the Krajina of Knin to sort of ward off Tudjman's police, Tudjman's sort of growing army, and this kind of thing. They essentially don't want to be ruled by Tudjman. They wanted to be part of Milosevic's state. Now they can see that Yugoslavia is going to collapse. They're increasingly sort of wanting not to be part of Croatia, but to be expanded, to be sort of included in this expanded Serbian state. So to sort of break away from Croatia and go into this expanded, this enlarged Serbian state. So even at the outset, even when Tudjman declares independence, as he does, as I say, in June 1991, as soon as he does, he becomes the president of a supposedly independent country, which nevertheless has large parts of its territory outside of his control. And his kind of delicate attempts, his careful attempts to sort of disarm these barricades, to recapture control of the Serbian Krajina, of those parts of Croatia which are now controlled by these kind of breakaway Serbian communities, all end unsuccessfully. They all end in kind of shooting wars, with casualties that helicopter is shot down. So it's almost impossible for Tudjman to sort of gain entry to these parts. And on top of this, it's not only that Tudjman has to deal with these breakaway parts of his own country, but he now has the added problem of this JNA force inside his country, in barracks throughout the country. Now, Milosevic is claiming falsely that the JNA are neutral observers, that they're going to be peacekeepers if they're needed at all. And that's why they're there in greater number within Croatia. But everyone knows at this stage that this is bogus, that in reality Milosevic intends to use the JNA as an auxiliary arm to sort of assist in this project of breaking away Serbian populated areas of Croatia and adding them to what he hopes will become an expanded Serbian state. Okay, so if we move to slide number 8, the offensive, the real fighting begins at the end of 1991, so the autumn-winter of 1991 and the beginning of 1992. Milosevic once again mobilizes the JNA, ostensibly as a peacekeeping force, it's what he claims, to protect the various communities within Croatia, the Serbian and the Croatian. But in reality, he's using these to back up these breakaway Serbian territories and to sort of bully Milosevic's forces away from them, so that he can kind of cut off territories of Tudjman's state and at some later stage attach them to an expanded Croatian state. So the war begins in earnest at the end of 1991 and the beginning of 1992. And you can imagine that initially those offensives conducted by the JNA are pretty successful. Tudjman's forces, Tudjman doesn't have an army. The territorial units of the JNA have been disarmed and disbanded precisely because the Yugoslav authorities were afraid that they would be used by Tudjman as the beginnings of an army. So he has very limited military force. He's been trying to smuggle in weapons before his declaration of independence, because he's anticipating this pushback from the JNA. He has a kind of police force which is like a paramilitary group. He has some diaspora groups which are coming back and which are fighting for him, but he has a very limited military force, whereas the JNA is a very large army, very well armed, very well coordinated, has very experienced officers, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of heavy artillery, and so has the upper hand, at least in the beginning. Now, these offensives create a lot of bloodshed. Most notoriously, a city, in Slovenia, which is in the east of Croatia, quite close to what is today the Serbian border. A city with a mixed population at the time of Serbs and Croats, but which was attacked and sieged by the JNA, and practically sort of destroyed, completely obliterated. All of its infrastructure, much of what was in Vukovar simply flattened. But also in the south of the country, down in Dalmatia, on the coastline, the historic town of Dubrovnik, the old town, besieged also actually by Montenegrin gunners. Montenegrins were working in cahoots with Milosevic at this time. The site of this, a lot of Western tourists would have been familiar. They would have visited Dubrovnik, they would have known it, and so they kind of immediately recognized this place, and were very shocked to see what was happening there, to see it bombarded by Montenegrin artillery, and to see it bombarded by Milosevic's forces. Now, finally, then, let's come to the last slide, slide number 7. With all of this happening, the international community springs into action, seeing what had happened in Slovenia and now what was happening in Croatia, and believing that action needed to be taken and action could be taken to try to sort of stop this conflict. The international community had really been confused about how they should act, not really understanding the situation very well, not really understanding, if you like, who the good guys and who the bad guys were. They were very reactive and really trying to catch up with what the hell was going on. As Yugoslavia broke down, as first of all this small war broke out in Slovenia, and now this much more serious conflict, which has involved much more fighting and much more killing, had began in Croatia. Now, initially, the international community, so the European community, now the EU of course had been formed at the end of 1991 with the Maastricht Treaty, but also the Americans, the USA, the State Department. Their initial hope was that Yugoslavia would stay together. They did not want the country to break up. Their desire was, as always, for stability. And they believed that if this country started to fracture, if Yugoslavia started to break down, that would cause huge amounts of instability within the region. But as it was becoming clear that the country could not be held together, but policy kind of changed, quite belatedly changed. And the international community changed its tack, changed its footing, and decided that after all, they would support the independence movements, they would support the sovereignty of Slovenia and Croatia. So when those two countries declared independence in the summer of 1991, the international community, by and large, also supported these decisions to sort of go for independence. And most prominently in this recognition was the newly unified Germany. Germany, of course, had been two states, hadn't it? The GDR, the communist East Germany, and the capitalist West Germany, the Federal Republic. But those countries had been reunited in 1990. And the leadership of the newly unified Germany under the Chancellor Helmut Kohl was looking, for an assertive role on the world stage, and they were very quick to sort of, ultimately to sort of recognize the sovereignty, recognize the independence of Slovenia and Croatia. Now, it was hoped that this was the period of the European Union coming into an existence, being formed, and the initial hopes, at least, were that the European Union, as it now was, would be able to deal with this crisis that was unfolding in its so-called backyard. The hope was that this newly formed union could show a sense of unity and a sense of purpose. And above all, it could show that it could resolve these problems without having to refer to NATO and without having to refer to the United States of America. Now, ultimately, this proved not to be the case, as we'll see, particularly when we come next week to talk about the conflict in Bosnia. Unfortunately, for many people involved, the European Union was not able to act decisively to prevent these conflicts in the region. Ultimately, it took the power of NATO and the power of the United States of America to resolve these to resolve this crisis. But at least initially, people hoped and people believed the European Union could solve these problems of its own accord. Now, they did at least broker a ceasefire at the beginning of 1992. In January 1992, the United Nations brokered a ceasefire, which was quite an inconclusive one. The JNA remained within Croatia. The breakaway Serbian territories remained outside of the control of Franjo Tuđman. That meant that about 30% of the territory of Croatia was beyond the control of Franjo Tuđman and of his forces. And by the end of this, so by the beginning of 1992, including the conflict in Slovenia, between 6,000 and 10,000 people had been killed, and about a further 400,000 had been displaced. They were refugees, and most of those were Croats who had been forcibly removed or who had fled the JNA and their sort of backers, their military offensives in the autumn and the winter of 1991. So it was a very tense ceasefire. The fighting stopped, at least for the time being, in Croatia. The war in Slovenia, of course, was over by this stage. But nevertheless, it was very unclear what was going to happen next. It was a very inconclusive peace. And it was not sure, no one was sure exactly what would happen going forwards. Now, the next front, and that's the one that we'll talk about next week, is the conflict in Bosnia. This threatened, by all accounts, to be a much more serious matter. We'll talk more about it in next week's lecture, but basically, all of the problems, all of the potential issues of different ethnicities, of different nationalities, nations living side by side, were compounded within Bosnia. The ethnic makeup of this territory, of this republic, was extremely complicated. I mean, if you go back to slide 4, we'll look at this in greater detail, and we'll look at better maps next week. But you can see, just from looking at that, that ethnic breakdown, that the composition of Bosnia was extremely complicated. And this really threatened to be a very violent breakdown, depending on what would happen in this part of the country, particularly following what had happened in Slovenia, what had happened in Croatia with those two territories, those two republics breaking away. It looked like if there was to be a conflict in Bosnia, it would be a much more serious affair. This was everybody's concern. This is everybody's fear. And in the event, it turned out to be a rightfully, those fears turned out to be, unfortunately, very well grounded. But we will talk about that in next week's session. So thank you.